The first movie poster was the French film La Rosière aux Roses in 1895, and they have been a staple of film advertising since. While there have been many dramatic, stylistic shifts over the years, they are still one of the things most identified with the medium. The goal of a poster is to grab attention of someone walking by, and the genre that did this best is horror. While there are certainly iconic designs for a number of other films, horror has its own place in the hearts and minds of people, especially those walking through a Blockbuster store aisle. Looking back to the 1930s and 40s with the Universal monster movies, an obvious trend emerges. A large focus on the titular character, typically with a female damsel in distress present. The fonts are bombastic, and the actors playing the monsters are typically top-billed. These early posters also emphasize colors, with blue backgrounds and defining yellows and reds. This is contrast to the films themselves, which were still in black and white. Blue and orange is still an extremely popular choice, especially in superhero films. Moving on to the 1950s, the variety of the posters themselves grew. There was now more focus on telling a story with more descriptive words. Horror, terror, superlatives like nothing and never before seen. As films grew in popularity, so too did the volume put out, and it became more important for individual films to stand out. There was still continued use of women in various states of terror. The predominant colors were still very similar, with lots of yellows and reds. One of the most iconic posters came at the tail end of this era with Psycho in 1960. It again featured a woman revealing clothes, although she did not seem to be in immediate peril. The use of color was particularly striking here, with Norman depicted entirely in red and Marion in yellow. It resembles modern art, although it's more off-kilter than the works of Piet Mondrian. After its release, the style of the poster was emulated a number of times, often adding more detail and thus reducing the effect. The 1970s saw a number of extraordinary posters, with much more divergence in style than before. One of the most infamous was the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, highlighting the film's tagline, "Who will survive and what will be left of them?" The way Leatherface is framed also implies a woman strung up behind him is naked, although there is no actual nudity in the film. The poster also continues the lie of the film, that it's based on true events. This type of sensationalist advertising would be used repeatedly throughout the years. Taglines became increasingly common as well, and were consistent across trailers and other forms of promotion. Alien is one of the most effective of these, with an incredibly minimalistic poster. Designed by Steve Frankfurt and Philip Gibbs, it evokes so much without explicitly saying anything. The design could be a creature's head, or it could be an egg, or even a planet. All this from a simple chicken egg and a little bit of effects work. There are dozens of incredible posters from this era, including blockbusters like Jaws or Halloween, the lesser known like Zombie 2 and Eyeball. It was definitely the time where it moved beyond advertisement for films to becoming its own art form. Interestingly enough, the 80s opted for more minimalism in posters. While there were certainly some that wanted to show everything, some of the more effective ones offered only a hand, or an arm, or the impression of a face. Movie monsters were on full, glorious display, with all manner of zombies, demons, and ghosts. In many ways, it harkened back to the Universal monsters, with the designs taking center stage again. The original Evil Dead is an example of the shadow of a monster. The film was banned in many countries, and while the poster was likewise censored as the depiction of a hand was considered too violent for some, it featured a quote by Stephen King prominently, which would inspire many other films to find similar praise from whatever sources were available. The colors of this era were often muted compared to earlier decades, as seen in the plain white text. The image says enough. A poster with less discretion is the original Hellraiser. The team behind the film realized that the makeup they had created for Pinhead was all they needed to draw people in. While it didn't make its budget back at the box office, it had a huge resurgence in the home video market, largely due to its presence on the shelves. The tagline is equally as chilling, promising terrorists from this frightening visage. The mysterious box also begs questions, adding a bit of softness to the otherwise abrasive image. The 90s was a less successful decade for horror. The posters were oftentimes very plain, opting for a lot of black and white, with a dash of red for emphasis. This trend largely died out, excepting the Saw franchise, which created its own spin and had annual installments, all with the same design. This reflected attitudes at the time, with the death of the boisterous 80s, and now grunge had taken over, and it was cool to not care. There were still a few standouts, however, with Silence of the Lambs being the best. The iconic image has some tiny details that may be missed in the YouTube compression. The skull on the moth is made of dead women, a nod to Salvador Dali's In Voluptas Mors. The maroon eyes are also a reference to the novel, where Lecter offers that they reflect in pinpoints of red. The image also invokes the concept of being without a mouth and unable to scream, referenced in Alien and the classic horror short story by Harlan Ellison. Coming into the 2000s, and aside from Saw's iconography, there was little tying the new wave of films together. There were classical references like The Descent, a focus on the killer in Hostel, and some more minimalist like The Ring. While there are a few standouts, overall there's a lack of interest in horror. A few companies were still chasing Scream's coattails, and the franchise remake had just begun, but the general belief was there wasn't enough money to be made in the genre. This changed in the 2010s, with big franchises taking off like The Conjuring and later It. Prestige horror came into focus, and now posters aim to look more artsy. They weren't aiming to inspire, fear, or disgust anymore, but to create interest with maybe a bit of dread. There's a lot more focus on people rather than monsters. However, posters also became less important in the streaming era at the end of the 2010s. Now the splash art was used more often, and the posters themselves were relegated to physical media, which had become less and less popular over the years. Thus, the posters in general got less attention and less care. While this certainly doesn't cover everything, that's a quick summary of the trends in horror movie posters. I hope you've enjoyed. Please like, comment, subscribe, and do whatever you can. Thank you, and have a lovely day.